Now we'll go live with Congressman Cole and hear a few words about the latest in the 4th District and in Washington. Congressman? Are you there, Congressman?
I am.
There you are.
Sorry, I apologize. I guess we had a little problem with the connection. But first, I want to thank Sarah, but I want to also thank everybody that took the time to listen in and join in this discussion. It's extraordinarily helpful to us. And let me just plunge right into what's going on in Washington, D.C. Obviously, this week, and really for the last 2 weeks, probably the main topic, without question, has been coronavirus. And what's the government going to do? How serious is the threat? There's lots of questions here. So let me back up a little bit and put a little context on this. Coronavirus is something we honestly didn't find out anything about until almost the very last day of December, so literally less than 3 months ago. It emerged evidently sometime in November in China. It's a variant of a series of viruses we've seen before where we get a transmission, we think, from animals to human beings. It's extremely contagious. It's we now have roughly 100,000 plus cases worldwide. Most of those, by the way, are in China, over 2/3 of them, and we've had 3,000 plus deaths. Most of those in China, all but 122. So it's been very virulent inside of China. But China's a big country. 1 out of every 5 people in the world live there, and it's spread beyond China. So we now have really serious outbreaks in South Korea, in Italy, in Iran, and we actually have outbreaks in almost 70 countries around the world, of course, including our own. The president, to his credit, honestly, recognized that early. He declared a national health emergency in early January, immediately imposed restrictions on travel to and from China and quarantine measures for people that had been in China and showed any kind of symptoms at all. And that probably bought us a lot of time to deal with this. We still have less than 150 identified cases in the United States, but we've had, I think, 11 deaths, 10 of them in the state of Washington. And obviously, this sort of problem that'll probably get worse before it gets better. Today, you actually, and yesterday, you actually saw Congress acting in a very bipartisan way to deal with this and to provide the resources that might be necessary. Now, again, we've done a pretty good job as a country for a long time. There's actually something called the Global Health Index, or Health Security Index, which is put out by Johns Hopkins, which rates the public health systems in every nation in the world, 195 different ratings. The United States is number 1, and one of the reasons why we're number 1 is for 5 consecutive years, we've actually put more money in our National Institute of Health, 39% increase in the last 5 years. In the Center for Disease Control, which actually responds to these cases immediately, 24% increase, a 34% increase in the money we were putting aside for what's called the strategic stockpile, which is our emergency reserve of drugs and medical supplies and equipment in a crisis. And finally, we set up something, and actually this was done when I was chairman of the relevant Appropriations Committee, Health, Human Services, and Education, something called a Infectious Disease Rapid Response Fund. And that actually provided the initial money to respond to coronavirus as it was spreading without Congress having to do anything. And literally, it's a special fund set up so when our healthcare professionals at the National Institute of Health, and more particularly the Center for Disease Control, tell us there's a problem, they can start spending money immediately. In this case, they spent money to bring Americans in the affected areas home, to set up quarantines, to start new trials, because it's a brand new virus. We don't have any history of it before. Number one, how do you diagnose it? So to start creating kits, if you will, that will be distributed to healthcare officials so they can test people. Second, there's therapeutics. That is, what are the measures you need to do to take care of what's a brand new disease? and then finally, eventually, a vaccine. Now, we're not very far away from doing our first initial test of a vaccine. It'll happen either late March or early April of this year, but it takes a long time to develop vaccines, so we won't really have one probably for a minimum of a year to 18 months, and it could go longer. It's just hard to predict that sort of thing. So in the meantime, we have to deal with the health care crisis, and that's really partly what Congress did the last 2 days. Congress voted to expend $8.3 billion to deal with this. And again, that was passed the House of Representatives yesterday by a vote of 415 to 2. So this was pretty unanimous opinion. And actually, in what's a pretty divided country and what's a pretty, tumultuous election year, to see Congress, Democrats and Republicans alike, work together, hammer out a common agreement, and vote, with only 2 dissenting votes out of 435, is a pretty big deal. Today, the United States Senate passed exactly the same bill, 96 to 1. Again, very bipartisan. It'll go to the president, and the president will sign it. If he hasn't signed it today, he'll sign it tomorrow. So there's a lot of things in motion that'll put us in a stronger position. They've been done in a bipartisan way. And while there's always a certain amount of disagreement, could we have done this or that better, the reality is the countries work together pretty well. And while this is a serious threat and it will get worse, again, we still have fewer than 150 identified cases in the country and fewer than 10 deaths out of more than 3,000 globally. So it's actually been a good response, and based on literally 4 or 5 years of making the adequate preparations to put us in a position as a country to respond. Now, aside from that, the normal work of Congress is going on. There are the normal appropriations hearings, that is how we're going to fund the government, which is funded through September 30th of this year. Other legislation's moving as well, but I think, again, the attention has been very much on coronavirus. So I would expect we'll continue to legislate on major pieces. We actually ended the year last year pretty strongly and in a surprisingly bipartisan way. All the appropriations bills were passed, that is, the bills that fund the government. There was a budget agreement on the debt ceiling, and there was a major bipartisan agreement on trade, the so-called USMCA, the trade agreement with the United States, Canada, and Mexico. We talk a lot about China, and we actually had a trade agreement with them as well, what's called a Phase 1 agreement. We still have more negotiations with them. But 40% of our exports go to our friends in Canada and Mexico. And both of them, either one of them, actually are more significant to the American economy than China, which after them is number 3. So major trade deal there with our friends and neighbors, a start of a major trade deal with China, and we also had a major deal with Japan in September. So, again, a lot of these things are moving ahead pretty well. Let me end with that, because I know we're going to have a lot of things to discuss here, but please rest assured that as you read and hear about the coronavirus, and I'm happy to talk about that at length, I actually am the top Republican on the Appropriations Subcommittee that funds the National Institute of Health, the Center for Disease Control, the Strategic Stockpile, and was the leader when we set up the Infectious Disease Rapid Response Fund. So our focus here has been very heavily on that. But again, I think people are actually working together. We're moving in the right direction, and I think we'll have as good a response as can be had in what's still an uncertain and unfolding situation. So with that, Sarah, why don't we open it up and take questions from folks?
Sure. And just a reminder to everyone on the call, if you'd like to ask a question, just press 0 and you'll be able to record your question and then return to the call live with the congressman. Our first caller is Vern, and he's calling from Oklahoma City.
Hey, Vern, this is Tom Cole. How are you?
I'm doing good, Tom. The question I was going to ask, you already answered it right at the top. But if I can, a different one.
Sure.
On the test kits that they were talking about on the news, do we have any of the test kits here in Oklahoma?
We do. And the number, by the way, will grow pretty dramatically. We did, to be honest with you, the Center for Disease Control developed an initial test kit, and they were testing very narrow section. That is, you had to have either been in China or been in contact with somebody from one of the affected areas. And so that gave us a pretty narrow screening process. And there was a technical difficulty with the initial test kits they sent out. They could test at the Center for Disease Control and give you an accurate answer, but some of the kits were defective. Those were recalled, immediately replaced. And we also did something, you do in emergency situations. Normally, these test kits are approved by the Food and Drug Administration, and that takes a while. But we have about what are called 70, what are called CLIO laboratories. That is, these are high-class medical labs that invent and develop tests. And rather than wait around for approval, the president made a decision on Saturday. Look, as long as they've run multiple tests themselves and they're satisfied, we want them to start putting test kits in the field, which they will. So literally, by the end of this week, we will send out something like 75,000 kits. Now, a kit sounds like it's for one person. It's not. Each kit contains 1,000 different tests, and you have to do multiple tests on an individual, but you can test about 350 to 400 people per test kit. So just multiply that 75,000 by 400, and then now we've got approval for private laboratories and pharmaceuticals to put out their own test kits, and there'll be more than 1 million of them out there. So pretty soon you'll start seeing them very readily available, because we know this disease is now, or this virus, is now coming not just from people that have traveled to China or been in contact, but we're beginning to have what's called community transmission. That is, cases that we can't identify a direct Chinese link, and those things are happening. So we want as many tests in the field as possible. We want people that want to be tested able to do that. Right now, again, we have the certified labs, which our public laboratories can do it, but we have a lot more private people who will start pretty quickly putting test kits in the hands of individual hospitals and physicians. We're not where we want to be right now, but we're about to be there.
All right, we'll move on to our next question. Just a reminder that if you'd like to ask a question, press 0, and then you'll be able to record that question and then return to the call. And if you'd like to opt in to future telephone town halls like this, you can also press 1 to do that. Again, press 1 to opt into future telephone town halls. Next caller we'll go to is Gus. Has a question about Social Security and Medicare.
Hey, Gus, this is Tom Cole. How are you?
I'm just fine. Mr. Representative Cole, how's everything? Hey, I'll send you several correspondence. Are we making any headway in locking up the Medicare and Social Security and get this thing taken care of?
We're not making as much headway as we should, in my opinion. About 60% of the money the federal government spends is in 3 programs: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. All 3 of them are slowly going bankrupt. They each have trust funds. The trust funds for Medicare and Medicaid exhaust themselves in the mid-1920s. For Social Security, 1933. Now, again, we're not going to stop funding them, but we need to rethink how we fund them, partly because, frankly, people live a lot longer, which is a good thing, not a bad thing, but these programs were not designed for as many people as are now retiring and living into their, let's say, 80s, early 90s. So we need to go back and look at it. And frankly, I think we will, but it's a matter that needs more attention, and you're right to bring it up.
All right, well, we'll move on to our next caller. Again, to ask a question, press 0 to record your question, and to opt in to future telephone town halls like this, press 1. Our next caller is Katie from Frederick.
Hey, Katie, it's Tom Cole.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, thank you.
My question to you is the question that we've all been asking for many years. Are we ever going to find a place where we can slow down or absolutely obliterate the terrible crime of abortion that we have in America? 50
well, yeah, no, actually, there's been a lot of progress on that. Frankly, part of it is a change of public attitudes. I think, honestly, the availability of sonograms where you literally see an unborn child has begun to change thinking. So the number of abortions in the country, well, I would still argue is too high, has actually come down pretty dramatically in recent years. It's not where it needs to be, but it's better than it was. Second, this president is a very pro-life president. And the law of the land says no federal dollars can be used for abortion, and frankly, none have been. That would be illegal. But we used to fund some organizations that were, they were pro-abortion. Didn't mean they recommended that. These were family planning organizations. Planned Parenthood is the most noted of them. But they still would refer people that came in for abortions if they thought that was the appropriate thing. That stopped. I mean, the federal funding for those have stopped. Those organizations are certainly free to exist and advocate their position. But again, I would tell you this president has probably made more difference than any other president. It's a surprise. It's unusual. It's a change from what his position was, but he's kept his word on that. But in the end of the day, it's really public attitudes that shape this, and public opinion has changed quite dramatically in recent years. So, again, I would prefer that we not have abortions other than in cases of rape and incest and life of the mother, but that's not the law of the land, and I think people are trying to avoid abortions now more than they were. So, some progress, but certainly not a perfect world in this regard.
All right. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, press 0, and to opt into future calls like this, press 1. Our next caller is Gary from Moore.
Hey, this is Tom Cole. How are you?
Yes, Tom. Excuse me. I understand most of our antibiotics come from China, and a lot of our health supplies come from China. Is there anything we can do about that? Can we open more labs or what?
We can do a lot about that, but you're exactly right. This is a situation that's developed really over about the last 20 years, and I think without people paying too much attention about it. And this crisis is a good example. Now, so far, we haven't missed anything in terms of what our normal supply would be out of China that we can tell. But if a pandemic breaks out, I mean, the Chinese are going to basically take supplies that historically might have gone to other countries, and we're not the only country, and look, they'll hold them to protect their own people. We would expect our folks to do the same thing. So beginning to diversify the supply chain is a really important thing. It's getting a lot of attention in Congress right now because of the coronavirus situation. One of the things we have actually in the supplemental that was voted is to guarantee a market. That is, there's a certain amount of purchases that will occur inside the United States from American companies. That needs to grow. Again, we save a little money by doing some of this stuff overseas, but you put yourself in a very exposed position when you're totally reliant on another power. I think you're going to see Congress begin to grapple with that problem. I know the president's concerned about it, the administration is. Frankly, I think people of both parties are. This is not a partisan issue. So, we're going to start doing it, but in the short term, yeah, you're exactly right. We're far too heavily dependent on China and to a lesser extent India, which also provides a great deal of pharmaceuticals in our country and a few other places. But about 90% of the ingredients, even when we make the pharmaceutical inside the United States, comes from somewhere else. So we're going to need to change that. And we're going to need, just like, in our defense bills, we actually sit down and look at what's the industrial base of the United States. And we, for instance, build Navy ships inside the United States, even though it's actually more expensive than it would be if we were to go to some place like Korea or South Korea or some other part of the world, maybe Japan. But we don't want to lose the ability to build our own ships because in time of war, obviously you can't replace them. We're very careful about this with things like jet aircraft and whatever. We're going to have to be very careful about this with pharmaceuticals going forward, because I'll tell you, and this is an area where I've actually spent a lot of time in my career working on, while I would never underestimate the danger of a terrorist attack, the reality is you're much more likely to die in a pandemic than you are in a terrorist attack. And so we need to look at defending the American people when it comes to biomedical challenges or diseases, pandemics, those sorts of things, just as much as we would in defense. So your question is very timely. I will tell you, Congress is beginning to think about this and thinking of ways to do it. There's actually a number of interesting legislative proposals, and you'll be happy to know they're very bipartisan proposals coming out from both sides of the aisle. That is, this is something that Republicans and Democrats don't disagree about. They actually want to work together on. That's how do you return more pharmaceutical production to the United States so we never find ourselves dependent on other countries for things as elementary as face masks or particular elements in drugs that are generic and pretty common. We just should never be in that position.
All right, we'll move on to our next caller. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, press 0. And if you'd like to opt in to future calls like this, press 1. Our next caller is Daryl from Bernieville.
Hey, Daryl, this Tom Cole. How are you?
Hey, sir, doing great. Thank you for the town hall meeting tonight.
Thank you.
So, my question, sir, I'm active duty Army. And I'm just wondering that no matter the outcome of the presidential election this fall, where does Congress as a whole really see us going defensive-wise over the next 4 to 5 years with things like base improvements, upgrading our VA hospitals, the care that we offer the veterans? Where do y'all as Congress really want to see us in the future?
Great question. And before I answer it, first of all, thank you very much for your service and dedicating yourself to protecting the rest of us. Look, this is something that we've actually made a lot of progress on in the last 3 or 4 years. For instance, the last defense bill had the largest pay increase for our men and women in uniform that we've had in a decade. We actually came to a bipartisan agreement on how much we'd spend on defense, which is almost $740 billion going forward this year. We've had very substantial increases in defense spending after some cuts. But the last 3 years, those things have moved up dramatically. In terms of VA expenditures, again, this is actually something our citizens feel very strongly about. When President Bush was president, he doubled VA spending in his 8 years. To be fair, Barack Obama also doubled VA spending in his 8 years in office, and President Trump has continued down the same road. Now, I'm not telling you every VA thing is perfect, but the United States of America actually spends more on its veterans, not than any other nation in the world, but than every other nation in the world combined. And I think that's because the American people genuinely appreciate men and women who put on the uniform. So, in terms of veteran services, I don't think there will be any difference, honestly, regardless of who's president. You'll see an increase in the Veterans Administration budget again this year. We're not very happy, Democrat or Republican alike, sometimes in the way in which the VA has administered itself. There's a lot of oversight hearings going on. We have a lot of cost overruns, but again, we're trying to make it much easier to access the benefits and make sure that more of our veterans use them. And actually, the usage of, let's say, VA hospitals and clinics has actually gone up pretty dramatically because the service has gotten better, the wait times have gotten less. And so, and Congress actually made it easier to fire people that work in the Veterans Administration than any other, agency of government, not because most of those folks don't do a good job. And in full disclosure, let me tell you, my dad was a career Air Force guy before he was a civilian defense worker at Tinker. My brother was also in the Air Force, disabled veteran, Vietnam era, not in Vietnam, but an accident. And My dad spent the last part of his life in veteran centers at Ardmore and Norman because he developed Alzheimer's, and frankly, he got great care at both facilities. It's care my family could have never paid for, but he had earned that with 20 years of terrific service in the Air Force and the old Army Air Corps, and his country was there when we needed him. So I think Congress is united on that. In terms of the defense budget, there's more of a debate about how big it should be, how robust it should be. I think certainly in the last 3 years, this president made it very clear he was going to rebuild the military, so we had very large increases in defense spending after a number of years of cuts. I think those are likely to continue, maybe not at quite the rate they have been because we had a lot of catching up to do. But look, I don't know anybody that wants to ever live to see the day when if we send American men and women in uniform off and ask them to do something hard, they don't have the very best training, the very best equipment, the very best support that we can provide. We owe them that, and we sort of make that agreement with him. So, again, I think we're going to continue to have strong national support for strong defense and a national recognition that we've made commitments to people that put on the uniform. Everybody that does is a volunteer. We tell them we're not only going to look after you while you're in the service, but we've got a benefit package for you when you leave in recognition of the service you're in to the country. I think Congress is pretty determined to continue to fund that.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next caller. If you'd like to ask a question, though, press 0. And if you'd like to opt into future calls like this, press 1. Our next caller is Sharon from Oklahoma City.
Hey, Sharon, this is Tom Cole. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine. Question has to do with the virus, and has anyone considered, are they talking about closing the southern border, or at least testing individuals? I know it would be very time-consuming, but you know we never know what's coming in.
No, you're right, and you're right to be concerned. I mean, most of the traffic that has concerned us has been, frankly, out of Asia. But we actually have folks that from Asia that enter the border illegally in the south, or people that come legally through southern borders at our ports of entry. We actually had a full brief on the latest response to coronavirus today in Congress, where we had representatives not just of the traditional medical agencies, the National Institute of Health, Center for Disease Control, Strategic Stockpile, but also from the Department of Homeland Security and from our border control people. And they are fully complying with the Center for Disease Control regulations. That is, they're scanning people as they come across the southern border. If we apprehend you and you've come in illegally, they follow normal protocols, just like they would if you flew in on a plane from China. They're going to interrogate you. If you're obviously physically ill, you're going to be held and tested and detained. So there is actually a major effort there. The danger, though, is, of course, there's people that come across that we don't catch and that arrive illegally. Now, the number of folks entering the country in the southern border illegally actually peaked in May of last year at about 130 to 40,000 a month. That number is down considerably to less than 40,000 a month. It's partly because of a vote that Congress took on a bipartisan basis, giving additional resources to the administration. It's partly because the administration has, frankly, instituted a number of policies like, hey, if you're coming in and claiming asylum, you have to wait in Mexico until we adjudicate this case. You can't come into the country. Partly because we've been working most of our illegal immigration. If you're Mexican and you come in illegally, honestly, we don't have to do anything. We can return you as soon as we catch you. But if you're from further south, you have to have a hearing. And so we're working with a company. There's primarily 3 countries. They're called the Northern Triangle: Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, where a lot of this has come from. And we've been able to cut that down quite a bit, partly by honestly telling folks we give foreign aid to those 3 countries. If you don't help us stop this, then the aid will stop. But also partly because they don't want to lose their people either. So again, the president's made and the administration's made, should say honestly the country's made, because this was a bipartisan agreement, a lot of progress in this area. But your concern is not ill-placed. All I can tell you is the appropriate authorities are doing everything. They are testing for the drug. They are holding people that they think may have been exposed, that has come from places where there are outbreaks or where there's obvious signs of illness. But, again, it's going to be a cause for concern until we get through this and then ultimately develop a vaccine so that our own people don't have to worry about infection from coming from abroad.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. Kimberly from Foster.
Hey, Kimberly, it's Tom Cole. How are you?
Well, hi, Tom. How are you? I'm fine. I want to know how prepared do you think Oklahoma is since they announced that we were going to be having our own test places to send our testing?
I think pretty well. This is one of those times maybe we're fortunate that we're not a destination. There are no direct flights to Asia from Oklahoma City or Tulsa. So I think things are, probably don't reach us as fast as like Washington State or California or New York, where they have direct flights. I have a lot of confidence in the healthcare officials in Oklahoma. We're very tightly tied in with the Center for Disease Control. Literally about 60% of the money we spend in Oklahoma on public health actually comes from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, which is our premier agency to deal with infectious diseases when they arrive. So, again, I think we're fairly well prepared. Our bigger problem in some places is in rural Oklahoma, for instance, we just simply don't have enough health care providers. Now, again, those are the places not likely to see an initial outbreak. It's more likely to happen in a metropolitan area. It's more likely, honestly, to happen in a place where there's a lot of traffic in and out of the state. But if something happens in rural Oklahoma, we don't have a strong enough web, if you will, of healthcare providers, in my view. We're doing some things here, and I know the state certainly is, to try and strengthen that, but it's a concern. So we're about as well prepared as we can be. I will tell you, as a country, we're better prepared than any other country in the world. Remember, there's been over 100,000 cases of this so far. There's been fewer than 200. Actually, it's right around 150, I think, identified in the United States. But again, that number will go up. And there are folks that maybe weren't tested originally. Now that we see this is spreading in like the state of Washington, that we have not identified yet. So I expect things to get worse before they get better, but I still think we are in a better position than anybody else. But if this is a global thing, 70 countries have had outbreaks. It's pretty amazing that the numbers have been as small as they are in the United States. And it tells me our folks are doing a good job. The United States, every year, by the way, there are 600 million people that cross the borders of the United States going in or out, and that's legally. I'm not talking about illegal. So there's lots of movement. Our relationship with China, our economies are closely intertwined. They're a competitor in many ways, but that's one out of every 5 people on the planet live in China. So there's thousands of people from China coming to the United States on a regular basis, and frankly, there are thousands of people from America going to China on a regular basis. This is where, honestly, the decision to restrict travel and to quarantine travelers has probably been one of the best decisions anybody made in this crisis, and the president made that decision very early in January. It was very. I don't think people realize how unprecedented what he did was. We've never restricted travel in the way that we did in January once we got word of what was happening in China. We've never quarantined people automatically, particularly including Americans coming out of the affected regions. So, again, I'm not telling you it's not going to get here. It already is here, and it will probably get worse. Well, it will certainly get worse before it gets better. but the number of cases we have for a country our size is really remarkably low. I mean, your chances of flu, for instance, are infinitely higher right now than they are of coronavirus. But the scary thing is it's a new virus. We don't fully understand it. We don't fully know how to treat it. We do not have a vaccine against it. So until we check the boxes, and that's a matter of time. I mean, the resources are there. Again, we have the best scientists and the best pharmaceutical industry and the best of everything in the world. We'll get on top of it, but it won't happen overnight.
All right, we're going to move on to our next caller. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, though, just press 0, and to opt into future calls like this, press 1. Our next caller is Scott from Ardmore, has a question about the deficit.
Hey, Scott, this is Tom Cole. How are you?
I'm doing good, Tom. Thank you.
Good.
I read a book a while back, The Debt Bomb, by Tom Cover, and frankly, it was scary. We talk about spending more money on the military and everything else. Where's the money going to come from?
Well, the book's a good book, and it raises serious issues that ought to be concerned. You have to understand what drives the deficit. And what's driving the deficit, and please let me put a caveat. I'm not saying we're trying to cut anybody's Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. We're not going to do that. But those three things are 60% of all federal spending. Military spending is about 15%. All the rest of what's called everything you think of as government, transportation, education, healthcare, is about healthcare, not meaning Medicare or Medicaid, but like investments at the Center for Disease Control. All that is even smaller than defense. So until you are willing to sit down and talk about entitlement reform, you're not going to balance the budget. Right now, 10,000 people a day turn 65 every day for the next 19 years. At 65, they're either already on or will be on Social Security pretty quickly, and they're immediately eligible for Medicare. And those folks will live a long time. And let me add, now that I'm 70, by the way, I think this is a pretty good deal. But they live a lot longer than any other time in American history. If you get to 65, you have a 50% chance of getting to 85 and about a 25% chance of getting into your early 90s, 93 or so. So again, that's an enormous expense that we didn't anticipate. It's actually something because medicine has improved enough that we've really extended life beyond what was envisioned when most of these programs were set up. So you have to sit down and have a discussion about that. And I actually have a piece of legislation. It's been bipartisan. I actually used to carry it with a guy named John Delaney. He was one of the Democratic presidential candidates this cycle. Didn't get very far. But John's a really smart guy. And we said, when's the last time we fixed Social Security and extended it? And it was actually in 1983. And Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House at the time, and Howard Baker was the Republican Senate leader, sat down. They designed a commission, and it recommended a series of reforms. Nobody's Social Security, check was cut, but it said, it increased the amount of income that was subject to Social Security tax. It very modestly raised the Social Security tax, and it then also delayed entry. So I was 34 years old at the time, and basically they looked at me and said, okay, your dad could get a full Social Security check at 65. It's going to be 66 for you. And you've got a 1-year-old son. It'll be 67 for him. But we're going to provide things like IRAs and 401ks that your parents and grandparents didn't have. You're probably going to live longer. And we're going to subject more of your income to the Social Security tax. That was actually turned out to be very popular and extended. Social Security was actually much closer to going bankrupt in 1983 when they did this than it is today. We still have a better than $2 trillion trust fund that we're drawing down. So we just need to sit down and have an honest talk. Social Security is actually basically a math problem. How long do people live? How much do they make? How much do they pay in? We no longer pay in enough to support the benefit level. But again, we built up a big trust fund. That trust fund's being drawn down every year. We need to figure out ways to replenish that. And I think those are doable things. Medicare, Medicaid are a lot tougher. We've expanded Medicaid to elements of the population. Historically, we did not think needed them, but we've decided they did, but we didn't increase the pay for. And again, Medicare, the basic problem is, again, folks are just living a lot longer. That's not a bad problem, but you have to address it. So, anybody that tells you that you can do it just by quote unquote cutting federal spending, you can't, because once you turn 65, you've earned a benefit, you've paid into that benefit, you're allowed to continue to draw it, and you should. I mean, that was the bargain the government made with you. But we're going to have to do some things to put additional resources in those programs if we're going to sustain them. Or, the other end of this is, at the top end, look, if you Warren Buffett, do you really need the same Medicare problem that somebody that is only living on Social Security needs? Probably not. Maybe you could pay more. We do that, by the way, in Medicare Part D on prescription drugs right now. Everybody's entitled to the benefit. You have coverage. You can be protected in case you get one of these rare diseases where the treatment, just is too expensive for a normal person. But if you make $80,000 a year as an individual or $160,000 as a couple, you pay more for Medicare Part D than somebody else does that maybe is only living on Social Security. Those kind of common sense reforms are what we need to talk about. But that's, again, what's driving the deficit. It's Congress actually, for instance, take defense. If you look at defense and what's called OCO, which is Overseas Contingency Operations, how you fund the military when they're fighting, we're actually spending less than we were in 2010. If you look at non-defense spending until last year, it was less than 2010. So it's really being driven largely by, again, these major, and when I say entitlement, please don't take that as a derogatory phrase. You are entitled to these benefits. You earned them, you paid into them, you played by the rules. But when folks live as much longer now and it's much longer than they used to, we're going to have to put additional resources in them if we're going to fund them at the same level. And or we're going to have to say, look, if you're financially independent, you need to pay a little bit more maybe than somebody that, again, has worked their whole life, been good folks, but all they've got is Social Security, and they don't have a lot else. They can't pay more for Medicare, but you're making $200,000 a year. You can pay more, and you need to. So those are the kind of discussions we need to have, quite honestly. Nobody wants to touch it because it's politically unpopular, but that's what's driving the deficit.
Okay, we're going to move on to our next caller. And again, if you'd like to ask a question, just press 0. And if you'd like to opt into future calls like this with Congressman Cole, press 1. Our next question comes from Mary from Ardmore. Question on prescription drug prices.
Hey, Mary, this is Tom Cole. How are you?
Doing fine, Mr. Cole. I'm just very pleased to be included.
Well, we're glad you participated. Do you have a question?
Yes. I asked about if there's been any progress made on the getting the drugs costs down with drug companies.
There's been some, but not enough. I'm still hopeful that's something that could happen this year. The sum is we've done some changes at the Federal Drug Administration that streamlines the approval process. That actually lowers the cost. We switched more to generics. That helps. But some of these things are enormously expensive to develop, and frankly, we have a lot of other countries in the world that freeload off the United States. That is, we pay for the cost of developing the drug, and then they don't contribute to that, but they get a much lower price. So there's actually legislation. There's 3 different bills in Congress right now. The president has a proposal of his own. There's something called the Grassley-Wyden bill in the United States Senate, which is bipartisan. Senator Grassley of Iowa is a Republican. Senator Wyden from Oregon is a Democrat. And then there was a House bill Speaker Pelosi passed, and they're all three very different, but there's some areas of commonality in them. That is, and they would lower drug prices. So there are some things can be done. It's tough to do in a political year. Honestly, any compromise deal, everybody gets some credit, and there's some folks that would rather have the issue than solve the problem. So I think we have a shot this year to do something that would begin to lower prices, but people are going to have to sit down at the table and compromise. Nobody will be able to get everything they want in negotiation like that. So a little bit of progress, but not nearly enough.
All right, our next question comes from Linda from Duncan.
Hi, Linda. This is Tom Cole.
Hello.
Hi.
Well, my concern is we were talking about Social Security and people living longer and then the cost. But, you know, the working middle class that have worked and get on an insurance plan in good faith, and then when a hospital in a county buys all the practices and then eliminates everybody that has that insurance from any kind of medical care in an entire county, it makes the elderly people feel like they don't count, and Social Security really can't afford us, so kill us off by not giving us any medical treatment. And I just wondered, is there any laws or anything being spoken about the, like, you know, in these areas where like 2,000 to 4,000 people are thrown out of the medical, or, you know, they just can't get any medical treatment at all of any kind?
Well, again, I'm not exactly sure I'm familiar with what you mean, but if we're talking about folks above 65, they're all on Medicare, eligible for Medicare. That's actually a much cheaper system than any other system that we have. I mean, you actually get more treatment, more options, and you've paid into it. You've earned it. So there's no question about that, and you can't be kicked off Medicare. So I don't know of any place in the state where Medicare won't buy you medical services. So again, and frankly, in Duncan, I know you've got a very good regional hospital there. It's actually one of the very best in the state. So medical costs actually for seniors tend to be lower than they are for any other part of the population because they get Medicare coverage.
All right, we'll move on to our next caller. John from Chickasha has a question about national defense.
Hey, John, this is Tom Cole. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How about yourself?
Good, thank you.
Good, good. You know, the question is, you know, all the years I was in the Air Force and spent some time in Korea, and other people have done similar things. So, no, what are we doing now? Is at some point, are some of those countries picking up their own cost of defense, or do we think we need to be there to use our superior defense methods? I guess I don't know. I mean, can we reduce those costs some, or is it doggone good sense to keep our nose in their business?
Well, it's look, I think your attitude is actually very much what the president's is, and there's no question we tend to pay more. Now, again, we're in Korea not just to protect the Koreans. We think that's in our interest as well, or in other parts of the world. But I will tell you this president has actually done a better job than any of his predecessors at getting more countries to put more money behind their own defense. NATO's a pretty good example. The president has gotten NATO countries to commit to spend over $400 billion more in defending, and putting resources into the NATO alliance. I will tell you, and let's take South Korea, which you mentioned you spent some time in. American forces in South Korea are actually based in facilities that the Koreans built and donated to the United States. it's actually cheaper to operate an American aircraft carrier strike group off the Sea of Japan than it is off the coast of California, because the Japanese contribute over $4 billion a year directly to the United States to help support the roughly 55,000 service people that we have stationed there. So, and there's also this to remember, and we forget this sometimes. You know, when we were attacked in 9/11, nobody in Europe was attacked, but we were attacked, and all of NATO declared what's called Article 5 and invoked it, and over 1,000 NATO soldiers, that are Danes, Brits, Germans, have died in Afghanistan fighting with American forces. We weren't there by ourselves. Now, Iraq, that was a different deal. We weren't attacked. We made that decision, although we had many allies there. The British are a very good example of that. So a lot of times we forget that these other countries, while we tend to pay more, and we actually have a minimum in NATO. You're supposed to spend about what's called 2% of your gross national product. That is the wealth the country creates every year on defense. There are 29 countries in NATO. The United States, by the way, pays over 3%, about 3.5%. Only when the president took office, only 5 NATO countries met their 2%. That's up to 9 now. He's pushed them, more and more of them, to do their part. So we're making progress in that area. I will tell you, having visited Japan, and which is an ally of the United States, their defense expenditures have gone up pretty dramatically. We train and operate with their fleet. We base forces in their country as a check on China. So we're getting there. We now have, and the Australians are some of the best in the world. They actually pay well over 2% of their gross national product on defense. We train with Australian forces in northern Australia out of Darwin, and rotate forces through there. So again, it will vary around the world, but actually over the last 4 or 5 years, more countries have begun to do more, simply because the United States has said, if you don't do more, we won't be here. So it's an area we've made progress, but we still have ways to go. But I will tell you, the trend line, and in the last 3 years in particular, has been in the right direction. That is, more of these countries doing more. And again, remember, when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, we didn't go there by ourselves. We did have strong NATO allies in Afghanistan. We had other allies. They weren't there as NATO, like the Poles, the Australians, and the British, that contributed substantial forces to the American effort in Iraq. So alliances are two-way streets. We've got some great allies. The British are probably the best in the world. They, by the way, more than meet their defense commitment. They're well over their 2%. And almost every major military operation since the Second World War we've been involved in, they've been there more than pulling their own weight, putting their own people. So, again, I would say it's a mixed picture, but it's gotten better.
All right. We're actually out of time for taking questions, but you'll have an opportunity to leave a message at the end of this call. We're near the end of our call now, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everyone's questions, but again, you can leave a message after this. To turn it over to the Congressman to provide some final words.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you very much, Sarah. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to visit with us. We can't always get to every town, but we really like these town halls. We actually reach more people and get to answer more questions. But we appreciate it. I appreciate you listening. We very much value any questions or comments that you have afterwards. We try to respond. If you contact our office, we try to respond there. I can tell you I personally sign about 25,000 letters a year that go out of here, and we appreciate every one of those inquiries or questions or suggestions. Finally, I will tell you, we will work very hard on this coronavirus issue. I hear more concern about that than anything else right now. But the other questions we got on everything from Veterans Affairs to defense, to trade, to health care, those are all, we are working very hard. I can't say we can solve every problem, but we've made some progress in most of these areas. And so, again, thank you very much. Look forward to visiting with you again. And as Sarah suggested, if this format works for you, please do as she suggested and contact you again, where you'll automatically be included in the calls. To set these up, we just literally call thousands of people, see who wants to stay on. But if we've got your name that this is something that interests you and you want to be included or have the option to at least be notified every single time, that way we can get that done, and that's very helpful to us. And again, we'll be going forward. So with that, again, thank you. Thanks very much for taking the time. God bless you and your families and our country. And I hope you have a wonderful evening and a great weekend.
Thank you, Congressman. And thanks again to those who joined tonight's call. If you'd like to leave a message, please press 1 now.